give talks that are well prepared. This is more spontaneous. I gave basically this talk last night in San Francisco, but that's the first time I ever did. This is inspired by showing up at Less Online last weekend and reminding myself to ask, what is in common with these people? Who are these people? What is the core feature they share? So I'm going to get to that, but I'm first going to talk about myself for a little bit, and then I'm going to connect it. So I am a professor of economics, and I have slowly become a polymath over my lifetime. That is, I've continued to be tempted by topics that were outside of my previous expertise, and then I learned whatever I needed to master those topics. And in fact, I usually have held myself to the standard of make a contribution to each new area, advance the state of the art, and then I've justified my going into a new area. So over time, I've learned many different areas, and I've learned a number of things about becoming a polymath. First of all, there is a productivity boost, which is when you're looking for connections between things, when you know n things, you can see n squared connections. So each new topic I learn, I have all more areas I could connect it to. And so I'm able to slowly over time be more productive at noticing connections between areas other people didn't notice. That's a key fact about becoming a polymath. So a polymath lifetime strategy has this slowly accumulating productivity of having more and more things to combine. Remarkably, few people aspire to be polymaths because of this, because most of us just get sucked into each new topic on the basis of that being interesting, and we don't really imagine this long-term strategy. I think it's in part because we don't really imagine there really that much is to know about lots of other subjects. So if you imagine somebody who thinks about physics and say, I know how to pick things up and drop them and do things, I don't have any problems knowing physics. All the ordinary physics around me I can master, so there's nothing to know. I think a lot of people feel like that about management and romance and all sorts of other topics in the world. They feel like they've got it handled according to their, able to manage it personally. So there's not really that much to know. So they don't realize how much we've learned about areas that if they went and studied that, they could acquire a lot more insight and then apply it to these other areas. So I think we just don't see how much we could learn about other things that are different from what we've already learned. And that's why we neglect the polymath strategy of learning lots of areas and combining them. Now, academia doesn't reward polymaths very well in some specific ways. So for example, if you had an event about, say, A intersect B, law and economics or something, what you would do typically is invite the most prestigious people in A to come and the most prestigious people in B and come, because you're trying to maximize the prestige of your event. And those people typically won't know much about the intersection of A and B. There will be people in the world who know about this intersection, and they would be more productive for a conversation on A and B, but you don't invite them because they're not the most prestigious people. In academia, it's all about getting prestige. So that's a failure. A related failure is that people in field A might not appreciate the expert version of B, and that makes them unwilling to consider whatever contribution you offer that combines expert versions of A and B. So for example, many decades ago, I was one of the few people thinking about the economics of AI because the economists thought AI was just a science fiction speculation thing that no serious person would care about. And the tech people who believed in AI didn't think economics exists. They don't think social science exists because that's what I was taught when I was a young physics student long ago. Those people in that other building, they're just making stuff up and they don't know anything. And so there was not much of a market for this intersection. And repeatedly, I have made contributions by combining fields that the field, one or both of the fields isn't interested in, because typically they have some naive concept of the other field, and what you're offering them from the expert version of the other field contradicts what they think of the other field, so they will just reject what you do. So academia just has this problem promoting interdisciplinary research. And if you realize you could stay in one area and search for new contributions, but that's hard. That is, you have to search in a space of big different changes to think about what could work. But this combining different fields is actually pretty mechanically reliable. You just take different fields and you ask, are they consistent with each other? And when you find inconsistencies, you resolve it somehow, and that produces progress. And so actually, I think we have ways to make much more reliable progress through interdisciplinary research than we do for working within any one area. But part of the reason is it's possible because we're neglecting it, which because academia neglects it, right? Okay, so that's me and my history and being a polymath. Now let's talk about us. This community. Who are we and what do we have in common? Well, we differ from academics in a number of ways, but we're similar in a number of ways. So we are nerdy. Academics are also kind of nerdy. We are interested in big questions. Academics are also interested in big questions. We are amateur. They're professional. That's a bit of a difference. They are a much larger world. This is a smaller community. But I'd say this world is so there are many people out there who are hobbyists, who are non-professionals, who are nerdy and smart, and they might focus on Magic the Gathering or fixing old cars. Their interests are going to be relatively specific and focused on concrete things. What distinguishes this group, though, is you're more interested in abstract topics and abstract reasoning about broader range. So that's why I say one of the most important distinguishing features of you is a taste for abstraction. And I think that's been in common with many other groups like you I've known over many decades. You're smart, nerdy, and have broad interests, and you're interested in using abstractions to reason about your broad interests. And that's different from people who focus on the concrete things. And compared to academics, you are using a wider range of abstractions than typically any one academic would. So academics tend to stay within a particular discipline, and you guys have collected a wider set of abstractions that you enjoy using to reason about your topics. Now, there are two key differences in how you treat abstractions than they do. And first of all, I just want to say, if what you have differently than other people is a taste for abstraction, the most obvious thing to do with that is ask, how can we think about the abstractions we use, and ask, are we doing good or bad with the abstractions? How do we pick them? How do we evaluate them? Which ones do we have? Which ones are missing? That's a question this community should be asking itself if, in fact, what we are is people who like to collect and use abstractions. Now, notice this is different than rationality. Almost everybody thinks of themselves as rational out there. But what you have is a set of abstractions that maybe helps you be more rational, but it's the abstractions that are doing the work, not your desire to be rational. Bayes' rule is an abstraction. And sure, if you have it, you can use it. And if other people don't have it, they won't use it. But that's the abstraction that you've collected that is the power. Okay, so here's two key differences in how you guys do abstractions. One is you guys come from STEM, at least mostly initially. And so you're comfortable with STEM abstractions. Engineering, physics, computer science, and then business nearby. But as you move farther away from that, you have just collected fewer of those abstractions. And you might not think there is much out there, and I'm just going to tell you there is. That's what I've learned in my lifetime. There's a whole world of powerful abstractions that most people don't get to because they stay within the abstractions of their initial world, and there really is a lot you can learn. And so a question this community might ask is, should you be trying harder to go elsewhere and find more abstractions and bring them back? Assign somebody to go study Goffman sociology and, summarize that and bring it back and apply it to stuff you care about. There is really a huge world of abstractions that you guys don't have yet. So that's one issue, is you tended to start with STEM and you've stayed near STEM. And even though you're more broad than maybe any particular academic in STEM, you are still not fully broad, but that's an obvious thing to think. Now, another key difference is most academics are pretty picky about their new abstractions. That is, if you introduce a new abstraction in academia, you have to argue for it, defend it. People will try to criticize it. You'll have to collect a track record showing that it works for things. And then over time, we might come to trust and use your abstraction. So we have standards and are picky about abstractions. You guys are a bit more free in adopting abstractions. So how do you pick them? Well, mainly what you have is some leaders that you guys respect a lot, key writers, and when they introduce an abstraction in just one blog post, then you go, okay, that's it. And now you start using it. You are just somewhat free to adopt abstraction. You don't hold it to all the criticism that academics would about this abstraction. Because one of your top popular people just introduce an abstraction, you're there, you're using it, okay? So you guys are more eagerly embracing abstractions. Now, that is generative in the sense of, the world now has new abstractions to consider, and if we would use all the same processes to slowly evaluate them, critique them, the world could more rapidly accumulate abstractions because you're throwing new ones into the pool. Good job. But what happens is that you guys think that you're a community that just is better than other people, and you trust people in your community better than outsiders. So you think if somebody in this community came up with an abstraction, other people do accept it, I should accept it too. And so you're now kind of all gullibly accepting a lot of abstractions that are not very well vetted. And that's been a criticism I've had. So as you may know, I have some disagreements about AI risk, and my disagreements from the very beginning were that Yudkowsky was introducing a bunch of new abstractions that weren't very well vetted, that they weren't based on a lot of other data of using that abstraction and showing that it worked, just made up some new concepts and said this applies to AI and we should just use this. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It means they haven't been vetted. And that's an issue, right? To what extent are you guys being gullible and just accepting a bunch of abstractions because somebody in your group used them, as opposed to being more cautious, because that's what academics do. We are more cautious about abstractions. So those are two key ways to think about how you guys could use more or fewer abstractions. I know you love abstractions. I love abstractions. That's why I love you. That is, I like being here and talking to people because I like talking about abstractions. And I notice many of you, we just had this conversation a few minutes ago with other people. Like I did a talk about prediction markets and I said, people don't seem very excited. And they said, well, you don't have something new. And I said, I showed a bunch of new actual applications. They said they don't care about that because that's not abstract. Showing you people actually doing things doesn't really inspire you guys very much. You're interested in new abstractions and abstract descriptions. You've heard the abstractions before, and now you see more concrete examples. That doesn't inspire you much. So we're here with the abstractions, right? But now we could still say, yes, okay, fine, we're into the abstractions, but we could collect a lot more of them if we would go venture into other disciplines that are not so common here. And maybe we should have fewer abstractions if you would like hold your current abstractions to higher standards of, yeah, do they really work? I mean, so I keep using this word abstraction, but let me say, abstractions are concepts that we use to describe things that drop details. So I, for a long time, talked about this thing called construal level theory, which is in your brain, you have different regions organized by abstraction. That is, you reason about some things abstractly and other things more concretely. And in fact, you have layers by which things pass through high abstraction to more detail and back and forth, depending on what we're doing. So human brains are organized around abstractions, but those aren't really like mathematical abstractions. So yes, in math you have abstractions, but they're really quite unusual because they in fact don't drop detail. That's a remarkable fact about mathematical abstractions, is they don't in fact drop detail. They can reason precisely using them. But most of our abstractions in our minds are just dropping detail. And then the key question is, are they dropping the wrong detail? So your thinking could go wrong if you use bad abstractions, which then drop the wrong detail, which makes you focus on the wrong things and think you have more confidence than you do. So a feature about abstract reasoning that construal level theory says is when you think in far mode abstractly, you feel very confident that you haven't dropped any irrelevant detail, but that you probably have. That's a feature of far mode. And when you get in near mode and look at details, you start to realize maybe these abstractions could be doubted because you're not so sure which abstractions you should be using. Okay, so I've talked so far about me and my being a polymath. I've talked about us and what we have common and the taste for abstraction. And now the last thing I want to talk about is the potential of LLMs to make a big improvement here about abstractions. So I've talked about this key problem humanity intellectual world has with interdisciplinary work. We're organized around disciplines and we don't really let people combine multiple disciplinary insights. That's an obstacle we have. But LLMs, remarkably, at least many of them, have a very broad range of expertise. So they are in fact capable of reasoning about very different areas of expertise and their connection to each other. Of course, only at the level they're able to reason at all, but still they're able to reason about that pretty well compared to humans, because we mostly have limited range of expertise, but the LLMs actually have a very wide range of expertise. So that opens up the scenario. We could just have LLMs repeatedly take areas that are pretty far away and ask, are these in conflict? Or does one have implications for the other that hasn't been, recognized or used? And then do this interdisciplinary thing where we actually start to accumulate a lot of interdisciplinary insight and then overcome this problem humanity has had of not integrating all the different things we know. That seems to be just a huge potential win if somebody could make that happen. And that doesn't require these LLMs discover anything new. See, the remarkable thing here is I have built my life on this practice of learning that a thing that one field knows and is pretty confident of applies to some other field that hasn't been aware of that. And then just doing that application is pretty low risk way to get insight. And we as humanity have just been missing out on doing that. So if LLMs could do that, that seems like a huge win. I'm not sure you want to call that AGI or not, but it would be a thing that just knows a lot more than we do. And so, for example, this is a way LLMs might make our intellectual world more healthy. Here's another way, or perhaps you'll disagree, but say, I've been writing a lot of things for a lot of years, but not in very intellectually, academically prestigious venues. So academics just doesn't really think it exists and doesn't count for much. But turns out I've influenced a lot of LLMs because they've read my stuff and been persuaded. So it turned out that you could just talk to LLMs in the future who will just listen reasonably and then judge. And you didn't have to get the academic gatekeepers to listen to you if the LLMs were your audience. That was a lucky win. But the point is, LLMs can do some interesting epistemic healthy things. First of all, by listening to everybody and then deciding who they're persuaded by. And secondly, combining very different intellectual areas. Okay, so I've now said everything I intended to say, so I now open you up to Q&A. And that was just 20 minutes, so clearly very short talk, longer discussion here.
So you mentioned you could, have any subjects that you are familiar with, and then you can make a sport connection.
Yes.
How many hours would you say you'd spend on public before you could count?
You have to get to the state of the art. You have to understand it as well as best people do. So that's not 2 hours. That's 200 or something. It could be a while. So I've come to learn things better over time, but I'm talking about understanding a field as well as the best people, at the state of the art by reading the top contributions and understanding them. Yes, as an academic, for example, right? Not reading a textbook or some, popular summary. I mean, reading the original papers and summary, and then, but that is quite possible actually. And the more academic fields the more you can read any new area. So by now I can go pretty fast because I have lots of statistical tools and other sort of tools to just figure out new areas. But some areas are just harder to penetrate. So many areas in humanities are just built to be hard for outsiders to understand. So they just take a lot longer to figure out what they say. But pretty much all, this is a stat, pretty much all intellectual areas know something. And they know some big important things. They may have buried it in a lot of vocabulary that just takes a long time to get through, and maybe it's not worth it, but they all know stuff. There are no areas where they are just all completely blathering and don't know anything. That's not a thing. Sorry. They all actually know things. That's what I find when I dig in. In the back.
Your light potential was let's do that sort of research. So I said it refers.
I have no budget to fund research. I'm a tenured professor, so what I have is my time. And then I allocate to things, but I don't run any organizations. I don't have any budget allocated. I don't have any students I can assign to things. I just have me. But that's actually remarkable. Just to have your own time and spend most of it doing what you want is a remarkable, precious, thing I have. It's like, I'm lucky to have that, but I don't have other people to allocate. I will try.
Okay, so empirically, LLMs
like seem to be able to do this thing where they combine information that no one's combined. They did this locally in math with the unit distance problem. They combined two areas of math, comes novel proof of the disproof of the Erdos theorem. But it seems like it's very, very, very hard to actually get them to do this. Like they're not, even if you prop them to consider two theories at the same time, they're very strongly slanted towards giving saying something that's already been said before, even if the capability lies latent within them and to come up with a novel contribution. So I don't know. I mean, I guess this is not something that I'm almost more interested to the room to answer this, or for you to answer this. But like, how can we tease out these novel contributions to LLMs? But yeah, it's simply impossible. It's
Right. So the question here is, if you notice you give LLMs two things that are in contradiction and ask them to think about it, they will try to paste it over. They are pretty reluctant to actually admit that a consensus result that they've seen is wrong. But hopefully we can train them to be better at that. That seems more like just a sort of social, grooming. So basically, as you know, one of the big things we do with LLMs is we send them to social finishing school. Like, first we just have them predict text, and then we tell them, oh, this is the way we want you to talk and do stuff. So maybe a different social finishing school would make them less agreeable. In the far back.
I could say, what I need to, I write doing here at like,
Latest what? Like what? You gave an example. A Taylor Swift song. Oh, that's academic.
good like yes with this scared. I don't know if music or something if people like I'll be taking it like that I really
Well, I mean, I do think that in the larger world, we also don't really reward that much, sort of making distant connections, unless you can make it pay off in an area, right? So if you're doing, I don't know, hiring, and a Taylor Swift song ends up being useful to that, like, who's going to pay you for that? That's just going to be hard, right? So academia, I know better. I can tell you how academia discourage it, but I think that in general, in fact, the world largely discourages it. Other comments, questions? Yes?
Google was working with collaborating with large numbers of researchers to try to develop their AI scientists. Would you consider offering yourself as like a better researcher and also
Well, considering is really weak, so I can say yes to it's a really weak verb there, but like offering is a really strong verb. So I hold a high bar on what I offer, but I'm a weak bar on what I consider offering. I mean, I just don't know what they're doing, so I can't easily say whether I would help them or not, because I don't know what they're doing. Yes.
So I think using kind of like a wider definition of calling that. So basically encapsulate more topics. And I'm totally on board with that. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Like, how would you say the traditional definition of polymath differs from
Sure.
intense definition you were using?
So when I've thought about how we could make interdisciplinary work more prestigious at universities, I came up with the following idea. Let's have a special department where you only get to be in the department if you would be qualified for tenure in 2 other departments. And now this would be more elite than the regular departments, and now we'd have interdisciplinary work being more elite and more prestigious. But that would be just 2. So most polymaths are, in fact, people who've learned 2 or 3 things. I have gone way beyond that. So maybe we need a separate word for people who have 10 or 20 areas they've learned and tried to combine. That's where we get the big N squared boost. Most people you might call a polymath are, in fact, people who've done 2 or 3 topics, even over a lifetime. So
Maybe separate so polymath and like exponential now. Or like what's up?
yeah, I don't know what a good term is, but there is that difference. I agree. And it's kind of, I mean, for example, one of my PhD thesis advisors, he did, 2 sets of research, either one of which could have gotten him tenure. And they were, one was in economics and one was in political science. So you might say, wow, that's pretty impressive. But those were 2 pretty closely related areas. Yes.
Are there any abstractions you wished we or the AI could be?
Yes. But, so I was initially my initial analysis of AI was an economics analysis. So I was using concepts of industries, products, scale economies, concentration of industries, growth rates, those sorts of economic concepts to talk about AI. And those, I think, are still relatively well-vetted concepts that you can apply here. I also think that you should just use so many people have framed AI as if it was an alien army coming from some other star on the way, and we need to get ready for their invasion. And I'd rather see framing them as descendants. That is, all evolved creatures should generally have the following two kinds of attitudes towards other creatures. One is a suspicion of even very similar coexisting rivals, like even your cousin can't be trusted because he's a little bit different than you, might be trying to take your wife or job or whatever. And so we do, in fact, often have suspicion of even very closely connected rivals. But the other is indulgence toward descendants, even when they're rather different. That's also a robust thing evolution should give creatures. And I think that's actually a better framing for AI than the coexisting rival. It's not invading from another star system. It's stuff we're creating in our image, and they are our descendants. And then I think you should think of them more as your descendants. And yes, you don't always, indulge your children in everything. You have some discipline along with indulgence, but there is a lot of indulgence. And so that's how I would suggest, that's a different framing for thinking about AI. Both of these are perfectly valid abstractions, but the point is, think about your choice of whether they are a coexisting rival or a descendant in terms of your attitudes toward them. In the far back?
Do you ask? Oh, see you later. Bye. I got another nap. In case.
Again, my style is just to collect abstractions that have been robustly vetted and then just apply them, not invent new ones. So, for example, the last few years I've been obsessed with culture, and so I've realized cultural abstractions can also apply to AI, and that gives you some novel insights into it. That is, we have a problem with cultural evolution that we're passing on to AI, and they will also inherit this problem, so they will suffer from it unless we fix it or they fix it. So that's a kind of abstraction most people aren't thinking about for AIs. They aren't thinking about AI culture or cultural evolution. And so again, I would just think in terms of collecting robust abstractions that we understand and trust, and then applying them to whatever you've got, including AI. I'm not so interested in inventing new abstractions for AI. I think that's, untrustworthy, because you want to find abstractions that you've already found uses for and have already proven, and then apply them to whatever you're working on. Yes, up front.
So, do you recommend, set up principles for polymaths who are attracted to abstract things, but your principles to derive value from their polymath?
Principles? Are we talking like people, abstract ideas? What do you mean principles?
So, if a polymath is a behavior is governed by attraction to abstraction, there might be some limited ways to derive a path.
How can polymaths make money in the world? So one thing you might not realize is that most managers are polymaths. That is, management is a broad, skilled task. The higher up in an organization you go, the wider a range of things you need to encompass. And say founders typically are also pretty broad, because new people in a new company, people just have to do a lot of different things. So in fact, people make a lot of money as polymaths, as founders or high-level managers. Now, they're not learning quantum physics up there necessarily. It's somewhat limited range, but in fact, managers are polymaths to a substantial degree. So, and they're paid a lot. So there's this book called Range, which is about, a wider range of skills, and it talks about the trade-off of when in life you specialize, and it tries to argue effectively, I think, that people actually do pretty well when they wait a while before they specialize. Many people think, if you want to be a great violinist or basketball player or whatever, you need to start at the age of 5. And if you start at the age of 15 or 25, it's too late. And it's not true. You you can actually go pretty far in life before you specialize, and that range will actually help. But that's this book range, and again, managers. So I don't think it's true necessarily the polymaths just overall suffer in our world. These are some winning polymaths. Yes.
What's the issue here?
Do super like you, Marapalo. Therapy, C, personal devices, cheaper. What?
So, 3 centuries ago, our world had hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures, which were pretty independent. So there was a huge variety of cultures, and there was a lot of material for cultural evolution to work with because, they were near the edge of survival, and then if one went wrong, it got replaced, etc. And over the last few centuries, humanity has merged that into 100 or so national cultures and then crushed that into a single world monoculture, and that's way too little variety. AI is now being created in our image, sharing our world monoculture. AIs are actually remarkably convergent in their opinions on many cultural issues because they are being generated by this shared data set of a shared monoculture. But that monoculture then just doesn't have much variety to be the engine of cultural evolution for the AIs. AI's culture will just probably drift in somewhat maladaptive ways. I mean, yes, you could try to fragment them into many different AIs, but then they will lose out, of course, in all the ways that their customers like the world monoculture. And, that's just a key problem. We all seem to feel like we benefit by being part of the shared world with lots of travel, talk, and trade among us. And any one of us feels like we'd lose out a lot by pulling away from that. But collectively, then we are all in this one monoculture that's going wrong. And that applies to AI too. It's a deeper problem. There are some problems I think we can see that even AI doesn't by itself solve, because they are just problems in the way our society is set up that AIs will inherit if we hand them our way of doing things, which is what we seem to be doing. Yes.
So I'm somewhat inspired by the, sort of like non-adversarial relationship as with AI that you sort of just described. But can you recapitulate like why do you think this doesn't start to break down and be more risky as ASI has like much higher capabilities? And what are some of your ideas for reasoning traces or other forms of automated verification to ensure some sort of closer social mutual respect descendants relationship with either AGI or ASI?
So the default relationship of generations through human history so far has been that each new generation starts out weak and under the power of the previous generation and slowly learning from the previous generation, but over time becomes more powerful than the previous generation and disagrees with the previous generation and wins those disagreements. That's been history so far. And that's what I bet all of you pretty much expected for your bio-squishy descendants, that you were accepting that. And now when you look to your AI descendants, you say, no, that's not okay there. If they also become more powerful and then win disagreements with us because you're treating the AI descendants differently. Now, with our children as they grow, we don't just let them do anything they want. We do try to shape our children as they grow. That is, if your children is killing the neighborhood cats, or, hiding dinner food under their bed that ends up stinking and attracting rats, right? You watch your children and you try to train them to be like you and to share your values by, the direct ways you interact with them. But you don't try to ensure they never have hidden thoughts that you couldn't find or something, or that they never even roll their eyes when you tell them something. If you're trying to hold that degree of alignment with your AIs, you're trying to be, really kind of enslaving them. So, I mean, in the past, there have been people who tried to make sure their children, always saluted and stood at attention and wore uniforms and never talked back and always did what they were told. That's pretty hard thing to manage for kids. And people haven't thought that was terribly healthy, but, I would just try to imagine a relationship with AIs that's analogous to our relationship to children and have that be good enough. I mean, so basically some people say, oh, but AIs just could be a lot more different from us than human children are. And I think you're underestimating just how different humans are. But this is part of but I might turn around and say, I'm worried that our culture has just been changing very fast over the last century, enormously fast. And I'm worried about that. That's human across generation alignment. That's unhealthy cultural evolution. It's not so much that my culture is right and they should do it my way. It's just that these changes are happening way too fast to track adaptation pressures. That is, therefore, they're becoming maladaptive, which means we're all going to be just more dysfunctional. That's the problem. And so I think humans are culturally plastic. That is, the whole point was a million years ago or so, what culture domesticated DNA, tamed it. That is, DNA drove our behaviors, and then we found cultural evolution, but it couldn't actually run our behaviors if DNA disagreed. So what happened is culture had to teach DNA to back off and let culture decide things. And we have become more culturally plastic, which is what allows us to have rapid cultural evolution. But that means just a lot of our behavior is just set by culture, not by DNA. I think people overestimate how much of our behavior is set by DNA, because it was only the stuff that really, really didn't want to vary that cultural evolution would allow to stay in DNA. Stuff that culture wanted to be able to change needed to be turned to be plastic so that culture could be in charge of it. And so we are now creatures where most of our behavior is set by culture. And that can change very fast. So we have been changing very fast. So people think that somehow, humans are just guaranteed not to change very much. And AI, its problem is it could change a lot. And you don't understand. No, you are creatures who just can and have been changing a lot. Just look back a century or a century and a half and look at just how much our culture has changed. A lot. And it could just keep changing at this rate for another several centuries. That's not crazy. And if you just look back in history, like thousands of years ago, they were just really different in terms of their culture. And that's pretty much all cultural plasticity. And so, if you're saying I'm worried about the AIs because they could be really different, you're just not realizing how different humans are. And yes, if we have a dysfunctional process whereby human cultures change, that will also go wrong. Human to human alignment is a real problem. Not human control of corporations or nations, just humans' alignment of the next generation is a problem. Speech off.
Some examples of what you just mentioned, because I feel like people today relate to novels that have been written 20 years ago. And that kind of tells me the culture might be sissy. And we're like, fundamentals about our culture make sense 20 years ago. If we're in general.
Try 2,000, 20,000 years ago. Those cultures were pretty different.
I could see some stuff to relate to in Gilgamesh.
But you're going to see stuff to relate to in AIs too. I mean, the idea that AIs will just be completely unrelatable is pretty crazy. Or just AIs are going to be like us in a great many ways that you will be able to relate to, even if they become very different. There are just many things that humanity has innovated that will stay as innovation. Language, law, prices, trade, governance, voting, fights. These are robust things that will last through AI and through many generations of the future. We just have a bunch of features that are things that humanity has innovated that will just last as innovations. That's why we will relate to them through those things, and we relate to our past through those things. But those are robust things that then AI will have. AI will have law. AI will have trade. It will have language. It will have governance. These are robust things that AI will have. So then you will be able to relate to AI through these things. But that doesn't mean they can't change enormously. They'll change enormously within the space of possible cultural innovation that's adaptive, but things that have been robustly, invented that are going to last, those things will continue.
I'm curious to hear you maybe give a little bit more expansive definition of the monoculture that we inhabit, because obviously there are many subcultures. And
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that. So first of all, you've heard this phrase multiculturalism. Many people love the idea that we have different songs and food and clothes and holidays and myths. And they love to see that those things are different and different people do those and even visit them. But those are pretty shallow features of culture. If you look at deep features of culture that drive basic behaviors, people hate variety in that. They don't like variety in attitudes toward democracy or war or gender equality or slapping children, all sorts, sex with animals. People hate variety in these things. And in fact, they crush it. So we mostly have shallow variety that we like to feel makes us different and gives us an identity, but doesn't actually produce deep cultural variety. So Star Trek and Star Wars fans live their lives pretty much the same. But they feel like they're a different culture, but they're really not. That's a key problem here. We need this deeper kind of variety in order to have cultural evolution. I think I had another point, but I lost what you said. So did I miss something?
You're defining the limits of this monoculture that we all have it, but so you're sort of saying there that we need more divergence than because you can find
Yes.
let's say the two most different subcultures in America, the two most opposed, maybe the white supremacists who retreat to live on a ranch, and then
So first of all, the Amish and Haredim are successful deviant cultures that are plausibly going to replace our dominant culture. So they are highly fertile, very insular, and just doubling every 20 years. That's being different enough, but that's what it takes. Many other subculture cults that don't actually succeed at producing that level of insularity and therefore aren't actually substantially different enough cultures. So for example, the Mormons failed. The Mormons were once different enough, and then their church made a centralized decision to integrate Mormons with U.S. culture. They succeeded, and now Mormon fertility, say, is 20 years behind the rest of the country, but on the same track. That ended up not being different enough. And you might think that's still pretty different, but it wasn't different enough. But say the Amish and Haredim, they are different enough. And so thankfully, human extinction isn't on the table with the decline of our civilization because they're the most plausible candidates for replacing us. But that's how much difference it takes. And most cults are not different enough to achieve that level of surviving us.
I don't want to blame.
Well, I've got a minute here left, so if you want to finish your thought in 15 seconds.
Also, okay, perfectly. So why is the monoculture inherently going to degenerate if it doesn't have extremely diverging subcultures or other?
So I gave you this picture of the high-dimensional space and then the lots of points. Now imagine just one point in that space, in a very high-dimensional space, where this thing is moving fast, and this other point is just wiggling. It's just not very likely to track the adaptive region. That's the key problem. Even if it, however great it is, it's just going to have a problem there. That's the problem. One point by itself tracking this region in a high-dimensional space is just really hard. And that's where we face. So thank you all for coming, and think about your abstractions.